Is James Wilt, and I believe James Wilt is now in the room. If you'll pause your live stream feed and turn on your audio and video, we can see you. Can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can. You have.
Excellent.
Please proceed.
Great. Good morning to members of the Winnipeg Police Board and to all the members of the public who may be watching this. As mentioned, my name is James Wilt, and I'm speaking today as a member of the organization Winnipeg Police Cause Harm. One of the groups I believe Chief Danny Smythe recently described in a Free Press op-ed as, quote, a loud and self-righteous segment of our community that uses social media as a platform to reject the need for police, unquote. I'm speaking to you today specifically about item number 4 on this agenda, the 2020 second quarter business plan report. More specifically than that, I'm speaking to you about the reporting of hours deployed on Winnipeg Transit or in the transit corridors found on the first page of the business plan report. This metric shows that the number of hours spent by Winnipeg Police on transit or transit corridors was 781 hours between April or June, almost 5 times higher than between January and March, and far higher than any point in recent history. Now, before speaking to the issue itself, I'd like to state my qualifications about the subject for the board. I'm the author of a recently published book with the Toronto-based Between the Lines books about transit politics in North America. For this book, I spent 2 years researching and interviewing over 40 transit experts across North America, including transit planners, academics, and community activists. I participated in online seminars about the book with the New York City-based Verso Books, the Toronto-based Word on the Street Festival in Conversation with Cory Doctorow, and other events in Edmonton, Hamilton, and Ottawa. I also recently published a lengthy feature article in the Walrus magazine about Canadian transit politics in the era of COVID-19. So in other words, I spent a lot of time researching and thinking about transit politics. So from that context, I can say that without a doubt, that greatly escalating police presence on Winnipeg transit buses and corridors at a moment in time when there has been a 75 to 80% drop in ridership and heavily reduced service due to a global pandemic is by far the most egregious waste of public resources and funding that I've ever seen in my research about the issue. It absolutely defies even the most ardently pro-police logic for police to respond to far lower ridership by ramping up their own presence. Making matters even worse and borderline comical if it didn't have such major impacts on the city is that the Winnipeg Police is now reporting $4.4 million in additional expenses by year end, primarily due to salaries and benefits. With respect, the Winnipeg Police Board and City Council has been taken for a ride by Winnipeg Police. The department is very clearly responding to calls for defunding and abolition of the police by artificially inflating budgetary demands through incredibly disproportionate allocation of resources to transit, along with downtown foot patrols at a time when there were literally 0 events happening. Councillor Marcus Chambers, chair of this board, told the Free Press earlier this week that police on transit is something necessary in order to promote and have, quote, good ridership and to, quote, make people feel safe. He also noted that it's unclear whether increased police presence results in lower crime rates on public transit. Well, as someone who has reported extensively on transit politics and is involved in a group, Winnipeg Police Cause Harm, that documents the violence of police interactions in Winnipeg, I can speak to this at length. For starters, police on transit is not a new idea. It's been discussed in Winnipeg since at least 2013. In the 2014 budget, the city set aside over $200,000 to add 6 patrol positions to Winnipeg Transit's budget. There have been ongoing disagreements between the Winnipeg Police Association and the city over who will actually perform these functions, with the association stating that using cadets to patrol buses is a violation of their collective bargaining agreement. And last year, the Winnipeg Police Association pushed back against assigning transit inspectors the power to detain. So police clearly see transit policing as an opportunity to increase their presence, especially through the Smart Policing Initiative, and justify funding increases. But police and enforcement on transit doesn't keep people safe. In fact, it actively undermines safety for many people. There is copious data from cities across North America about how transit policing and enforcement disproportionately harms Indigenous and Black people. In Edmonton, Indigenous people have received 44% of transit tickets since 2009, despite only making up 6% of the city's population. In Toronto, Black people received 18.5% of transit tickets issued between 2008 and 2018, despite only making up 8.9% of the population. Armed transit police in Vancouver shot and killed an Indigenous man in 2014 and handed over an undocumented migrant from Mexico to the Canadian Border Services Agency in 2013. She hanged herself while in government custody at the airport awaiting deportation. It's also a long-standing myth, not just related to transit policing, that police presence deters quote-unquote crime. Unpacking this in full is beyond the time constraints of this presentation, but I'll note that at this moment that police, including Chief Danny Smythe, themselves admit their role is primarily reactive. Even their supposedly smart policing initiative depends on cycles of incarceration and surveillance that break up families and communities, jeopardize housing and employment, and breed paranoia and distrust among neighbors. Many people are criminalized. Black and Indigenous people, people who use drugs, unhoused and poor people, sex workers, and trans and gender non-conforming people. On the broad subject of policing, it is beyond clear that the massive police budget must be defunded and reallocated to the things that actually keep people safe: housing, food security, harm reduction, mental health and substance use resources, and non-carceral and non-violent crisis response. But let's focus on the issue of transit safety and ridership specifically, as alluded to by Councillor Chambers. Even before the pandemic hit, we knew why many people don't ride transit: lack of affordability, accessibility, reliability, frequency, and comfort. These conditions have become significantly worse during COVID-19 as transit service was cut and workers laid off. Early research out of Toronto shows that many transit riders have continued to use transit throughout the pandemic to get to grocery stores, pharmacies, and to visit family and friends. By far, the worst public health problem facing transit agencies across the country is overcrowding, the absolute opposite of what is required for social distancing and limiting transmission. The solutions to the situation have been very clear since day one. Protect transit workers by eliminating fare collection and requiring rear door boarding for those who are able, increase bus service along busy routes to reduce crowding, provide masks for riders who don't have them, and introduce bus-only lanes to increase reliability and reduce the amount of time riders have to spend on the bus. All of these proposals are long-term solutions to the problems facing transit ridership and safety. And of course, these require permanent transit operating funding from higher levels of government, as transit organizers across the country have been calling for. But the city is not powerless to make funding decisions like this, as evidenced by their allocation of over $250 million a year to a department that is failing to keep people safe. Instead of taking these steps to improve transit, Winnipeg's highest funded department increased its incredibly expensive presence on transit almost fivefold. As council members are aware, police officers cost a massive amount of money. In 2015, there were more than 1,000 Winnipeg police officers making above $100,000 per year. It is a profound waste of money in the best of times, given that we know that alternatives to policing exist that more effectively keep more people safe. It's even more true during a global pandemic when the presence of police on buses is directly taking away resources from the things that actually protect people from COVID-19. Eliminated fares to protect interactions with drivers, better service, and public distribution of masks and sanitizer. The number one way to improve transit ridership is to properly fund and support transit. Seattle has increased its transit ridership by 50% since the early 2000s by providing consistent and frequent service. Every driver who switches to taking transit for most of all of their trips is reducing emissions, congestion, and danger to pedestrians and cyclists. This should be a top priority for the city, given that we're on the brink of catastrophic climate change, which also necessitates the reallocation of the huge road building budget to other ends. Further, the leading cause of altercations on transit are related to fare collection. Abolishing fares, like has been done in Dunkirk, France, and Kansas City, Missouri, is a guaranteed way to reduce altercations, increase ridership, and eliminate the need for discriminatory and costly fare enforcement. Winnipeg could easily reallocate the funding that is paying Winnipeg Police to ride transit to reducing or abolishing fares on transit. The statistics in the Winnipeg Police's business report should shock every member of this board. Not only is there no justifiable reason for massively increased police presence on transit during a pandemic with significantly reduced ridership, but that massively increased police presence is directly taken away from the things that would actually keep people safe on transit. This is indicative of a much broader problem in Winnipeg. Life-sustaining services like transit and community services are subjected to constant austerity while police continue to rack up their budget and council refuses to meaningfully act. I'll conclude my presentation by reiterating that police on transit do not keep people safe, nor do cadets, transit inspectors, or any other quasi-police role. By far the most significant public safety issue facing Winnipeg Transit is overcrowding during a global pandemic, which can only be addressed by significantly increased funding in order to run more frequent and reliable service. I implore this board to take the statistic in the business report extremely seriously and consider how to prevent this massive and unaccountable waste of public resources from ever happening again. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, James, for your presentation. Board members, are there any questions of Mr. Wilt? Ali or Edna? Thank you. We'll move on to our next delegation. Daniel.
Thank you for your time.
Daniel Friesen.